And welcome back. In part 1 of chapter 14, the Reconstruction Era, we saw how presidential Reconstruction ultimately failed and gave rise to radical Reconstruction that aimed at punishing the South. Today in part 2, we'll see how for a short time a period of promise existed for African Americans as they exercised their political rights, and how this period of promise would turn to a period of tragedy with the ultimate collapse of Reconstruction in the South by 1877. During this presidential election year of 1868, Republicans nominate Ulysses S. Grant for president. Ulysses S. Grant was the hero of Vicksburg, the hero of Appomattox. He was the savior of the Union, and by 1868, he was the most popular man in the North. If paparazzi had been around, his would have been the photograph that they coveted the most. He was the closest thing that we had to an actual celebrity. Keep in mind, there's no movie stars, TV stars, or internet stars. So Ulysses S. Grant was the man of the hour, and Republicans know if they can get him in their corner, basically, they've got this election locked up. Now, Democrats will pick Horatio Seymour from New York, and the central issue of this election year will be Reconstruction in the South. Republicans want to remind voters in the North what party was responsible for the Civil War in the South, that being the Democrats. This was known as waving the bloody shirt. Now, they didn't actually wave a bloody shirt, but again, this was reminding voters that, again, in the South, the Democrats had been responsible for the war that had killed perhaps your brother, your sister, your husband, your cousin. And so, again, they're trying to drive home that point with voters. Now, Democrats, what do they talk about? Well, they denounce Reconstruction in the South. They say it's unconstitutional, and oftentimes these Democrats will openly pander to racism. With this election, what we see is Grant is going to win this by a slim margin. Grant, when he wins this, will be the youngest man elected president, 49 years old at the time. Now, he will be the first West Pointer to be elected president, and he will also be the first president to be elected without an all-white majority. Blacks in the South will overwhelmingly vote for Ulysses S. Grant, accounting for over 700,000 votes, which equates to 12% of the vote at the time. In response to this, Congress will pass the 15th Amendment that will guarantee black male suffrage in the United States. As I said, blacks overwhelmingly voted for Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant was seen as also in the same kind of vein as Abraham Lincoln, responsible for their newfound freedom. And they flock by the droves to the Republican Party. Again, the party of Lincoln, responsible for securing their freedom. Now, throughout the South, there's a black explosion of political activity. What we see are there are mass meetings. There's a palpable energy that can be felt in wanting to participate in politics. Now, when I say politics, most people kind of tune off. But you have to remind yourself, at this time, these people had been marginalized. And so now they were given an opportunity to address long-standing grievances and take their voice to the ballot box. Thousands of African Americans throughout the South will join something called the Union League. The Union League was an auxiliary arm of the Republican Party in the South. Now, by the time of 1870, the former Confederacy, the South, has been brought back into the United States, but it's under these radical Reconstruction Republican governments. And the Republican Party, like I said, controls all of it. Now, if you see in the cartoon, if my picture isn't blocking it, this is a cartoon from, or I should say a drawing from Harper's Weekly. And what we see is there's 3 African-American men there, and these kind of represented the leadership areas, or leaderships that was provided to African-American communities. Here we have, as you can see, the first man with tools in his pocket. He's probably a craftsman. The next guy in the suit was probably a freedman before the war, probably has something of a formal education. And what we see is in the background a Union veteran of the Civil War. So these were the 3 types that would give leadership to the African communities in the South. Now, like I told you, black voters overwhelmingly give their support to the Republican Party. And over 2,000 African Americans will hold public office throughout the South. And there's a tendency to think that blacks controlled Reconstruction politics, and this was the myth that was perpetuated by white Southern Democrats, and this was not the case. What we saw was the highest offices still remained in white hands. But ultimately, what this shows is there is a fundamental shift of power in the South. Those traditional Southern white Democrats, that kind of planter aristocracy that had held sway before, during, and after a little bit of a period after the Civil War, they're no longer in power. For them, their world has been turned upside down. Now, in South Carolina and Louisiana, what we see is the most prominent office holders had never experienced slavery. They had been freedmen before the war, and they had never really experienced the harsh trauma of it. What we saw was most slaves, however, who had been former slaves, had established their leadership in the black communities as well. Now, there are new groups coming into the South, or I should say there's one new group coming into the South and one group that's starting to grow in the South. The group coming into the South would be known as carpetbaggers. These were Northerners who at one time had been South, usually in the Union Army, had kind of liked what they saw, the environment, and they wanted to live in the South. Some were adventurers, others investors, and for Southerners seeing this, these Northerners coming down with their carpet bags looking to kind of take advantage of kind of the bad economics of the South for their benefit, they referred to them as carpetbaggers. What this was, a carpet bag, as you can see on the left, was a bag literally made of carpet. At this time, most homes did not have carpet wall to wall. That just didn't happen. What you had were large squares of carpet. And over time, when they had been worn out, these carpets, instead of being kind of thrown out, were reconditioned and made into bags of carpet. It's the term carpet bags. And these were kind of the kind of duffel bags, sports kind of bag of the day, where you could easily put in all your belongings or most of your belongings for a quick trip. And what we saw was there was another group in the South, also known as scallywags. What scallywags were white Southerners who were Republicans. And for white Southern Democrats, they were traitors, basically. Traitors to the region where they lived, traitors really to their race. And so most of these so-called scallywags had never owned slaves, were Unionists who had supported the Union during the Civil War, and were mainly from the Upper South. These two cartoons here illustrate what we're kind of talking about. On the left, there's two gentlemen on a platform next to a train, and they have their carpet bags getting ready to go to the South. As you can see within the passenger car there's a man who looks somewhat sinister with his carpet bag. So you can imagine what Southerners thought of all these Northerners coming down and what they were trying to accomplish. On the right is a cartoon of a scallywag, one of those white Southern Republicans, and as you can see, he's trying to assist the African American to vote the certain way, or the Republican way. And as you can see, he's a former veteran himself because he's still wearing parts of his uniform. And the cartoon says, "The wolf and the lamb in politics," implying that the scallywag is looking to take full advantage of the situation in benefit of the Republican Party. Now, like I told you, the South's traditional leaders who had held power before and during the war and for a short time afterwards, they were opposed to these new radical Reconstruction governments. Looking at this, they saw that they were corrupt, inefficient, and they often said that this was examples of black supremacy. Like I said, these former power holders' world had been turned upside down. Now their slaves were taking part in the political process in the South. Now, was there actually corruption in these Reconstruction governments? The answer is yes, but there was corruption throughout all government in the United States, local, state, and federal. And we'll talk about that with Ulysses S. Grant. Now, at this time, many poor whites were starting to warm to the Republican Party. However, this warmth is soon cooled when taxes are actually raised, and this forces a lot of Southerners who were starting, like I said, to find common cause with the Republican Party. It forces them to back away. So really the biggest opposition comes in the South from blacks taking part of civic life at this time. There is a campaign of violence against blacks to get them to cease from taking part in the political process in the South, or have them vote certain ways that will favor the former white Southern Democrats. And the cartoon right here in the left-hand corner illustrates what we're seeing: voter intimidation. Apparently, they're wanting him to vote a certain way, probably not the Republican way, and keep in those traditional white Southern elites who had been into power. Now, by 1865, violence was widespread throughout the South. The civil government had broken down right after the Civil War, and what we saw was by 1867, 2 years after the war, the violence now that had been widespread or unorganized is becoming more local and organized. Throughout the South, there are secret societies that are sprouting up to stop blacks from voting, and they're looking to try to overthrow these Republican Reconstructionist governments. The most famous of these secret societies will go by the name of the Ku Klux Klan. It was founded in Tennessee by a former Confederate general, Bedford Forrest. The name Ku Klux Klan actually came from the supposed sound of the barrel of a rifle being pulled back, Ku Klux Klan. Now, if you look at the picture on the left, the Klan uniforms are probably not familiar with what you're familiar with. Usually you're familiar with the white uniforms. That would come with the second rise of the Ku Klux Klan. This is the first Ku Klux Klan, and as you can see, their sheets were made out of whatever materials they could get. It was very intimidating, especially at night when these people would come to you and give you a visit at your homes, and they were said to be the ghost of dead Confederate soldiers. And it also made a convenient way of hiding your identity when you took part in really the political violence and terrorism of the time. And what we saw is, again, the Klan's activities were directed against those blacks and whites who aided African Americans in the South. Like I said, the brunt of the violence was directed toward African Americans in the South, and really this was mass terrorism. And it kind of comes to a head in Colfax, Louisiana in 1873, in which a black settlement was threatened by the surrounding whites who had actually obtained weapons, cannons, and threatened the community. Black soldiers were brought in to calm the situation, and what we saw was they would be taken prisoner and hundreds would be massacred. So it was obvious that these Southern Reconstruction Republican governments couldn't take or get a handle on what was going on. It seemed they controlled things by the day, almost, and by night these secret societies like the Ku Klux Klan ruled supreme. Now these Reconstruction Republican governments appealed to Washington, D.C. for help. They appealed to Ulysses S. Grant. Grant, working with Congress, will pass a series of laws known as the Enforcement Acts that allow Ulysses S. Grant by 1872 to crush the Ku Klux Klan. In areas where the Ku Klux Klan had been active, the army would be sent in. What we saw was supposed members of the Ku Klux Klan would be arrested and held in prison without trial. So, like I said, by 1872, Ulysses S. Grant has crushed the Ku Klux Klan. However, what we're seeing is by the 1870s, the North's commitment to Reconstruction is starting to fastly wane. The radicals that we had talked about, those radical Republicans, are gone, either having died or being voted out of office. And what we saw was Northerners pretty much felt that the South needed to take care of its own problems. They couldn't be expected to step in every time to save the South. This was coinciding with the time of the birth of liberal Republicans. These liberal Republicans had really felt that the federal government had taken too much power, and ultimately that the best men had been excluded from government. Those who came from prominent families, had great educations, came from money, the kind of traditional kind of rulers in the United States. This was actually reflected about what was happening at the North at the time, because at this time we talked about the rise of immigration from Ireland and Germany. Specifically, the Irish are taking part in the political system in the North, local and state. And these kind of traditional elites in the North are now starting to feel the effects of this. And again, they see that the best men have really been excluded. And the guy who's really leading these liberal Republicans is Horace Greeley, who will coin the phrase that we'll talk about in the next chapter, "Go West, young man." They nominate him, a newspaper publisher, for their candidate as president. And as you can see, or maybe not see, because my image is blocking it, he has that very prominent neck beard that apparently was in the style of the time. And thank goodness certain styles don't come back. Now, this liberal attack continues throughout the North, and there's a resurgence of racism as well. What we see is James S. Pike, was a journalist who supposedly journeyed to South Carolina to observe the state Carolina legislature. And he writes the book, The Prostrate State. To be prostrate means to be laid out on your back. And what this book said was that basically the government of South Carolina was black controlled, it was black supremacy, it was inefficient, and it was corrupt. And Northerners are actually reading this. And this is also kind of helping to sway Northerners against Reconstruction. Now, by 1873, the country falls into a Great Depression. And of course, when bad economic times hit, the party in power is usually voted out. And this is what happens in 1874 when Democrats take over the House. Now, before the old Congress leaves, those Republicans and some of those still radical Republicans that are still there, they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1875. What this act ultimately did was outlaw discrimination in public places like theaters, hotels, horse-drawn carriages. So again, what we know now as the Civil Rights Acts that we've kind of talked about found their birth during this Reconstruction era. Now, Reconstruction is pretty much on the defensive. What we're seeing is those radical Republican Reconstruction governments are starting to kind of fall away. Democrats are now taking power in Tennessee, North Carolina, and Texas. They refer to themselves as redeemers. To redeem something was to correct a wrong situation. And how these Southern Democrats see the situation is they're going to try to roll back everything that these radical Reconstruction Republican governments have done. Where Reconstruction governments still exist, they're facing open violence. And now they are going back to Washington to Grant to ask for help. Grant himself is now kind of caught up in his own kind of political scandals. When he became president, he appointed his friends, his army buddies, his wife's friends and relatives to various spots throughout the federal government. And then they proceeded to pretty much embezzle from the federal government and take as much money as they could, getting him caught up. Now, Grant didn't benefit from any of this, really, but it showed that he wasn't at the wheel of government, that he was kind of an ineffective president. And so when these Reconstruction governments go to ask for help, Grant's too busy, like I said, with his own scandals, his own problems. And basically he says that the North is really tired of trying to fix the South's problems. They're going to have to fix it themselves. And as you can see, here is Ulysses S. Grant right there smoking, if my picture isn't blocking it. He actually smoked up to 20 cigars a day. Ultimately, he will die of tongue cancer. After he leaves the presidency, at this time there's no pension for presidents. He's flat broke. And to provide money for his family, he will write the first presidential autobiography. And it's really become the kind of gold standard other presidential biographies kind of mark themselves against. If you ever get the chance to actually read this book, it is actually a pretty easy read, kind of, believe it or not, it seems like it was written in modern times, not in the late 1870s. Luckily for Grant, he finishes the book just right before he dies, and his family is left with the royalties from the book. Now, what we're seeing is what's happened in the South so far is directly going to influence the presidential election of 1876. Republicans now nominate a new candidate. They look for a candidate that's easily sellable to the American people, and who they find is Rutherford B. Hayes. Rutherford B. Hayes was known for not really offending anybody. He had been a hero during the Civil War. He had had 3 horses shot out from underneath him. He himself had been shot 5 times. And so he looks like he's a good candidate that they can sell to the American people. The Democrats, in turn, will choose Samuel Tilden of New York. Now, during this election, the states of South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana, which is still under Republican control, will be the states that will decide this election. Now, at the time of the election, at the day of the election, Rutherford B. Hayes thinks he's pretty much lost this. He's going to go to bed thinking he's lost the election. He even tells reporters that he thinks he's going to lose this thing. Republicans get word to Rutherford to basically shut his mouth, because what's actually happening are behind-the-scenes negotiations are taking place with these states. If these states promise to back Rutherford B. Hayes, certain agreements have been reached that Reconstruction will pretty much be over. The troops will be sent back to the barracks. They won't interfere with Southerners in Southern problems. There will be a transcontinental railroad that will go through the South, and that Hayes will actually appoint a Southerner to his cabinet. It appears that a compromise was reached, and this will be known as the Compromise of 1877. And an election that looked like it was going in the way of Samuel Tilden's favor, all of a sudden kind of turns strict right, and the next president of the United States is Rutherford B. Hayes. With Hayes becoming president, Reconstruction is now over. As we said, Reconstruction at the time was a time of great chaos, like we said, with the end of the Civil War and trying to put the South back together again, trying to redefine what it was to be an American, what rights did American citizens enjoy. It appeared to be a time of great promise in which blacks were able to exercise their political rights. And ultimately, what we see is Reconstruction would turn to tragedy with the ultimate failure and with the Compromise of 1877. Tune in next time when we will talk about the Wild West with History with Hens. Thank you.